They called her a beggar before they learned her name. They called her a nuisance before they saw the bruise on her knuckles from crouching too long. They called her a problem and stepped around her like stepping around a stain. The shop owner did worse. With a heavy hand and a hard face, he lifted a plastic jug and let a stream of cold water splash over the little girl's shoulders and hair, as if the volume of his disdain could wash her away. It was the kind of scene that compresses time. The hiss of water, the small dress clinging to a thin body, the dark smear on a sidewalk that was never meant for a child to sleep on. People looked toward the sound and looked away. A woman at the coffee cart fumbled for coins and then kept them. An old man muttered about city ordinances. The shop owner barked at the girl, voice flat with tired authority, and pointed the open doorway like it was the only place left in the world where he had rights. She did not shriek. She only blinked, wiped her face with the back of a small, dirt-streaked hand, and tried to gather something that had slid from her grip, a tiny paper-wrapped snack, oily and warm even after it had been hidden. The paper fluttered along the curb and disappeared under the low belly of a parked car, safe for now, her life in miniature, stashed where tires and shadow met. A passerby moved before the crowd could decide. He did not shout, he did not push or call the police. He stepped forward, put his hand on the shop owner's sleeve, and said quietly, but with enough force to make heads turn, "Stop, leave her be." The owner stared as if he had been interrupted in the middle of something important. People's eyes darted between the two men, one whose apron was still dusted with flour, one whose coat was pressed and whose shoes held no dust. The passerby crouched, not to kneel, but to be eye level, to be human level, and looked at the girl with a softness that surprised everyone there. When the girl blinked up, trembling and damp, he took off his scarf and wrapped it around her shoulders, as if it were the simplest of things to do. "You okay?" he asked, and the way he said it made asking sound like the only reasonable response. She said her name, Helena, with the kind of voice that named the world she carried, small, certain. The shop owner spat something under his breath, something about children and rules, and the passerby turned his back and, still without speaking loudly, offered a hand to help the girl steady. Nobody filmed him. Nobody asked who he was. In the crowd's imagination, he was already a stranger who might as well be invisible. That anonymity kept him safe, and it kept him clean. The owner wanted her gone. The passerby said no. That was the first image. Water on a dress, a paper-wrapped snack sliding into shadow, a hand extended. People remembered the water. People whispered about the passerby's shoes.
But no one knew yet that the man who stepped between humiliation and a small child would not be content to stop there. They moved away from the storefront the way you move away from a wound, briefly horrified, then guarded, as if the world would resume its shape once they turned their backs. The passerby led the child a few paces to a patch of sun and sat with her on a low concrete step. He unwrapped the snack, and when she offered half without drama, he took it as if it were a gift. They shared 2 bites, and the warmth between their palms spread in the way small mercies do. If someone had asked him then to tell his name, he would have shrugged and said it didn't matter. If someone had taken out a phone to record, the passerby would have dropped his hand, pulled a coin from his wallet, and paid for the owner's coffee to avoid more spectacle. But people had already decided their stories. Somewhere in the crowd, a child would later whisper to a neighbor, "He looked like someone important," and an old man would scoff. The passerby did not correct them. He kept his face ordinary because he wanted what he was doing to be ordinary too, a small, necessary interruption in a day that would otherwise have swallowed a child whole. Helena walked him to the edge of the viaduct where her grandmother waited. They had been there as long as concrete had allowed them a corner, a patchwork of blankets, a thin mattress, a crate that held their few things, and a stack of newspapers that doubled as insulation and, more importantly, as a place where Helena learned letters. She loved words the way other kids love candy. She found them in scraps of discarded newspapers and in the names printed on cardboard boxes. She loved the sound of a consonant and the way an R could roll like a little wheel. At 6, she could sound out some strange words you wouldn't expect beneath a bridge, and she loved to show off small triumphs. Her grandmother, Dona Nosa, held herself with a kind of dignity that did not benefit from being noticed. Once, many years ago, she cooked in a small family restaurant with the kind of rhythm that made good food. She had a way with stock and bones, with cauliflowers and onions, with making a handful of tomatoes taste like a festival. The restaurant had been the center of her pride. A few years and a string of bad luck later, it had closed, and pride had become a shield against charity. She refused to be pitied. She refused help that felt like a performance. When the passerby approached the little group under the viaduct the next morning, he did not announce himself as a savior, and he did not bring a camera crew. He carried a folded blanket, a paper bag with 2 warm snacks carefully wrapped, and a small stack of children's books he had bought at a thrift shop because their colors had reminded him of a memory he could not name precisely.
He left the things a respectful distance away and sat down on a crate with his hands folded, like a visitor in someone else's kitchen. Dona Nuisa watched him through the curtain of her hair. Her eyes were a map of years spent standing in heat and flames and carrying pots that told better stories than any of her neighbors wanted to hear. She did not ask for help. She scanned the passerby for the kind of motive she had learned to read in people. What did he want? Was it pity? Was it a headline? Was it a favor to be collected later? The passerby, when asked, said he had seen what had happened at the shop, and he was sorry. "Sorry does not buy bread," she said, and there was no bitterness in it. It was simply a statement of reality. He nodded. He did not argue. He warmed the snacks over a portable stove and handed one to Helena. Helena, who had offered half the day before as if it were a lesson you always offered when you had so little, offered half of this warm snack too. She was little enough to make generosity seem like a matter of instinct, and in that gift was a rebuke and a blessing both. The blanket stayed folded nearby, a quiet presence. The books sat on Dona Nuisa's box and were opened and then closed, more because touch seemed allowed than because reading them felt like anything beyond a luxury. The passerby offered nothing grand. He offered steady presence. He offered small, consistent returns. He listened when the grandmother told him about the cameos of their lives, the days when laughter filled the kitchen, the nights when the rain drew a new map on their blanket, the time a rat had taken a piece of dry bread and left the rest like a small, treacherous imprint of hunger. He asked little, but he noticed everything. How Helena folded her small hands when she wanted to hide a face, how Dona Nuisa kept a wooden spoon polished like a relic, how the blankets smelled faintly of steam and frying oil. He learned that Helena had a habit of hiding a snack under a car because the older kids stole anything unsupervised, and she had learned that the shadow beneath a bumper was a better safe than a pocket. He learned that Helena could read a few words and loved the word tomorrow more than most children do, perhaps because it felt like a promise she had to say out loud to make real. For days, the passerby came and went like a patient tide. He learned where they kept their cups, and how, when the wind was sharp, they would put the crate against the mattress to block the draft. He bought socks in a size that fit little feet and left them in a neat pile. He brought a thermos full of soup and a spoon, and Helena showed him how to count the bubbles when the soup simmered. Once he read to them from the children's books, making exaggerated voices for the animals, and even Dona Nuisa laughed at the parts where a goat would refuse to cross a bridge in the story, because the laughter felt like a relic they were storing for later. Around them, the city churned. Trucks hoisted crates, horns complained, the shop owner painted his sign with temper, and the world mostly turned away. The passerby never told Helen a single thing about his life. He kept his hands in his pockets when he walked into their space, as if even the sight of his watch or his shoes might make the grandmother draw back. He never asked for thanks. He insisted on doing small things, mending a torn blanket seam, tightening the rope on a makeshift curtain, covering a crate with a tarp before a predicted rain. Those things, practical and humble, stitched him into their days. Helena learned fast to call him the man with the scarf, and she used the name with the same mixture of affection and surprise that children reserve for unlikely friends. She would bring him a page she had torn from a newspaper and read him a sentence, "The market closes at noon," and then beam as if she had discovered a new planet. The passerby would applaud like it was the most extraordinary thing in the world. Those small performances felt like keys. It was not only his gestures that altered things, it was the rhythm he forced into them. He did not arrive as a hurricane, he arrived like morning, regular, inevitable. That rhythm offered a different kind of dignity than donations do. It implied that they were worth habitual care, that their existence deserved the same predictable respect one gives to mail or to meals. Dona Nuisa watched the pattern carefully. She did not call it kindness because the word implied a contract she did not intend to make. Instead, she called it attention because attention could be refused and returned without changing the ledger.
One afternoon, when a cloud attempted to blot out the sun and the wind carried the smell of frying oil from the shop across the street, the passerby sat on the crate and opened his newspaper. There, between the carpentry classifieds and the weather, was a photo of a modern cafeteria, bright stainless steel, humming with the smell of soups, and a caption that read, "New catering contract brings local flavor to corporate lunchrooms." He glanced at the picture, then at the neat folded blanket beside him, and for the first time the passerby's hands were not steady as he smoothed the paper flat. He left without offering a plan. He left a small envelope near the wooden spoon with a folded note inside that read in careful, unhurried handwriting, "When you are ready." Dona Nelsa found it later and held it up as if the paper were a fragile thing. She turned it over in her fingers, wary and a little afraid. That night she spoke to Helena about how favors carve obligations into backs. "You must not accept what will make you owe," she said, and there was a lifetime of cook's discipline in it, a way of refusing even generosity that comes wrapped with strings.
Helena frowned, like she had only ever counted one kind of coin, the kind that made people feel full now and left the future to someone else. Meanwhile, the passerby's days moved in a parallel current. He rode subways and read memos in bright offices with glass walls. He had a desk where people dropped issues they did not want to touch, and a calendar that filled with meetings. He wrote polite notes about budgets and approvals. He exchanged small jokes over coffee and seldom spoke of blankets and spoons upon returning to his desk. In his briefcase, beneath a folder marked with client names and timelines, lived the memory of a small, damp dress and the hiss of water. He took that memory into meeting rooms and let it sit in the corner of his mind, like a photograph you do not show. At work, the man everyone knew professionally as Daniel kept his distance from the political currents of the office. He had been taught, as so many professionals are taught, that compassion was a private thing and risk was a public thing. He had also been taught that time was a currency one had to spend wisely. Yet the photograph of the cafeteria in the newspaper nudged something else awake. It whispered possibilities, not salvation, not rescue, but an ordinary leverage that could be used to create small rooms of safety within the structure he already inhabited. For the passerby, the moral of the water on the little girl's dress was never about punishment. It was about seeing. Who else would see a child who hid her food under a car? Who else would notice that a grandmother once cooked, and that those fingers that had turned onions into family were still steady? That question followed him into the lunchroom and into a meeting where budgets were debated, and a man named Marcelo, who loved to name risks, explained aloud the dangers of intervening emotionally in people's lives. Marcelo was the sort of colleague who had built his authority on caution. He had an eyebrow for numbers and a way of comparing feelings to line items. He did not believe in stories without spreadsheets. He regarded the passerby's new tenderness as the kind of indulgence that made accountants nervous and shareholders whisper. "We can't mix corporate resources with personal missions," Marcelo said once, as he tapped his pen on a contract. "Not unless it's a structured program. Otherwise, we're asking for liabilities." Marcelo listened. He did not argue that charity should replace policy. He only asked quietly what harm there might be in hiring a cook who had years of experience and a desire to work, or in offering a room in the company's employee housing for a family in need. Marcelo, who had never stood by a viaduct and listened to the small ways hunger spoke, repeated words like precedent and repercussions. "They don't belong in corporate lunchrooms," Marcelo said. "They don't belong in our balance sheets." The passerby left the meeting with the taste of cafeteria photos in his mouth. He sat at his desk and looked at the city map, then at a spreadsheet that read like a foreign language. He thought of a small wrapped snack sliding under a car, and of the way a child's generosity offered him half a coxinia, as if it were a small trust placed into his palm. He felt foolish, of course. He felt rich in ways that made him clumsy. But he felt something else, too. The sense that his resources might be used to create a different kind of ordinary for two people who had been excluded from it. That night, he walked past the shop owner's storefront again. The owner saw him and nodded, as if to say the world had righted itself. He had chased the child away, and one more jaybird would not nest on his stoop. The passerby kept walking. He did not want applause. He had no plan for announcements. He only wanted to know whether he could muster the courage to translate a private shame into a public correction. In the quiet of his apartment, he took a small notebook from his shelf and began to write down names and numbers. He drew a rough sketch of how a kitchen could look, a small team, a hired cook, a schedule that would give someone stable hours and a paycheck. He listed the steps: an interview, a trial day, a modest stipend, a room allocation. The words were practical, flattened into a sequence that might survive scrutiny. Yet even as he wrote, he felt the resistance of 1,000 Marcello-like voices that would measure kindness by risk. Helena, back beneath the viaduct, slept wrapped in the scarf that smelled faintly of cologne and the passerby city. She dreamed of a table where plates were warm and laughter came without being purchased. In the morning, she would tuck a scrap of torn paper into her pocket, an inventory of words she had learned this week. She would place the scrap carefully beside the crate that held the children's books. She would, in her small way, tally the things that might become a life. When the passerby came back the next morning, he carried the same blanket folded the same way, the same small thermos, and something new. He brought with him a clean, plain business card that had his name on it and an email, and he placed it on the crate where Donna Nusa could find it and pretend she had not. He was not ready to tell them everything. He was not ready to tell the world, but he wanted to offer a tether, a way of saying, if you need us, you can find me. Donna Nusa picked up the card with the suspicion of someone who had once given her life to a restaurant and had been repaid in closures and bills. She turned the card over and over, read the letters as if perhaps they would rearrange into something safer. She did not call. She did not ask for a job. She simply kept the card inside the pot they used to warm food and looked at it at night, like a secret. Weeks passed in the quiet way small revolutions begin. The passerby continued his visits.
He found himself speaking at a staff meeting one morning, not to announce a policy, but to tell a simple human story about a child who had hid a snack under a car. He did not make it dramatic. He described the water, the photograph that kept him up at night, the blanket on the crate. The room hummed with the normal discomfort of people who equated feelings with obligations. Marcello raised concerns about liabilities. A few colleagues joked awkwardly. But something had changed. People listened in a way they had not listened before, and that was the beginning. At the viaduct, Helena borrowed a word from the page she had been practicing and used it to describe the passerby. Steady. The word stuck, and she pronounced it like a magic charm. She pinned it to his shadow in her mind. She began to narrate his arrival in a way that made him into a fixture of their small world. One afternoon, as autumn brushed the city with cool air, the passerby decided to act in a way that would not be dramatic and would not be large. He walked into a small office with polished floors and spoke to the woman in charge of employee catering with a kind of businesslike calm that surprised them both. He asked about hiring a cook for the company's small cafeteria. He proposed a trial. If a local cook could deliver 3 days of meals that were both good and cost-effective, he would endorse a modest contract. The woman asked for details. He provided them. They laughed about menus and allergens and the odd boredom of corporate salads. The passerby did not mention Helena or Donna Nusa. He did not say why this mattered. He spoke of numbers and schedules to survive an initial scrutiny, and then gave the woman a name on a card, Donna Nusa's name, and the woman's eyebrows arched, like they were tracking a joke that might not be a joke. The passerby left the office with agreement to run a small trial. He had not announced himself as a benefactor. He had not called a press conference. He had only used the tools at hand, an offer of honest work, a line of space where a person could earn. Not everyone approved. Word moved in small circles to places where people like Marcello sat and folded opinions into files. "Watch out," a colleague said. "It could get messy." The passerby listened and did not deny that it could be messy. He accepted that there were rules and processes, and that good intentions made for poor policy when wielded without thought. He also believed that the space between policy and heart was where the living had to be saved. Back under the viaduct, Donna Nusa stood in front of her old wooden spoon and considered a job interview she had not thought she could do without a resume, a certificate, a shining recommendation. Her hands, which had once scaled fish and sweat over stoves, trembled when she replaced the spoon in its place. She ironed a shirt because ironing was an old ceremony. She tied her hair into a knot to keep it out of the way.
She rehearsed what she would say about her years in the kitchen. Her pride had made her proud enough to refuse charity. Now it allowed her to accept work. Helena, who had been listening, watched the grown-ups perform their uneasy dances. She wrote the word steady on a small scrap and tucked it into her sock. The scrap was a talisman. She said a sentence she had overheard once: "Good cooks make people stay." She repeated it until the phrase grounded her. She did not know if Donna Nusa would get hired. She only knew that hope, when practiced, could be like kneading dough, firm and patient. The day of the trial arrived. Donna Nusa prepared a modest menu: stewed beans, a rice that had the ghost of a good stock, a vegetable side that the passerby insisted tasted like fall. She brought simple bowls and wrapped the food in a way that made sense, like clothes folded for travel. The company's cafeteria sat in its bright room, and the employees filed in, curious and cynical in equal measure. The passerby sat at a table in the corner and watched like any other patron, taking small bites with a face that was trying not to betray the fact that his life had rearranged itself around this one test. People noticed that the food was different. They noticed that it was cooked with an attention that made it feel like an invitation. They noticed that the cook had hands that were trained, and that she had a way of moving that turned the act of ladling into something respectful. A few compliments floated across the room. In a small meeting corner, Marcelo folded his arms and said, "Not bad." He did not mean praise, but it landed like one. When the trial concluded, the cafeteria manager sent a short, practical message. The food was approved for a limited time, pending a few adjustments. The passerby exhaled in a way that was neither triumph nor relief, but something steadier. The little engine of dignity had found a track. He had not saved anyone. He had, instead, created a legitimate place of work. Donna Nusa had earned a contract. It was the kind of progress that did not show well on a banner or lend itself to sensational headlines, but it mattered because it lasted. That night, back beneath the viaduct, the crate had a new cushion on it. The company provided a small room in their overflow housing, not charity, they called it, a staff accommodation for a care worker to use during odd shifts. It was modest and tucked in a building that smelled faintly of disinfectant, but it had a window and a door that closed. Donna Nusa took one step inside and then sat on a thin mattress and raised her eyes toward the ceiling, as if checking that the whole world had not been rearranged without her permission. She felt foolish and brave at once. Helena watched the window's light spill across the little room as if it were a stage. She took the passerby's scarf and wrapped it carefully around itself, then placed it in a box with the half-eaten coxina wrapper from the first day.
She made a small paper boat from the corner of a newspaper and set it on the windowsill like an offering. That night, in the dim glow, she wrote the word "steady" in a large hand on a strip of paper and pinned it inside the room so it would be the first thing anyone saw when they stepped in. That scene, the paper boat, the pinned word, felt like a quiet victory. The passerby had not announced himself. He remained, in public, the man with a scarf. The shop owner still painted his sign on a corner and still spat at shadows. Marcelo still reserved the right to be wary. But within the small angle of the viaduct, something had shifted. The passerby's anonymous presence had become a hinge upon which a life began to swing. The story did not end there. There were petty indignities, of course. The shop owner muttered in the street, throwing glances like knives. Neighbors complained about the outsiders who came and went. There were forms to fill, red tape to navigate, and the quiet bureaucratic reluctance that greeted every attempt to lift people to a place of normality. The passerby had made an offer to the company. He had taken a risk and used his access to create a modest job. But there were other things he did not yet know. He did not know how the owner who had poured water would react in the long term, nor did he know how the company's culture would bend under the pressure of compassion. He also did not yet know what it meant to be known. For Helena, being known had been as simple as someone stopping the water. For the passerby, being known meant stepping out of anonymity into a web of expectations, explanations, and the possible discomfort of the people who thought he had behaved outside of his station. He had been content to be the quiet man with the scarf. Now, as the paperwork for a trial contract circulated and colleagues asked questions, that quietness would begin to unravel. The next morning, as light pooled in the gutters and the city prepared for a day of errands, the passerby stood outside the shop and watched Helena skip over a puddle with a resilience that made him ache. A customer at the shop muttered something about spectacle and reputation. The passerby tightened his scarf, feeling it like an armor and a reminder of limits. He had done what he could so far. There were choices ahead that would not be solved with blankets and soup. He reached for his phone and scrolled to an email he had drafted in the night, a short note to the company's human resources person, a proposed framework to formalize the arrangement for Donna Nusa, to ensure fair pay, insurance, and a path to stability. He had not yet hit send.
His thumb hovered, aware of the eyes that might read it, the opinions that might form, and the ripple that could extend beyond the viaduct. He thought briefly of how the shop owner had hosed a child like dirt, and of the way the crowd had stood, like an audience unwilling to interfere.
A choice is made of many small decisions, an email sent or unsent, a phone call made or delayed. He felt the responsibility like a weight he could not ignore, and the fear that it might be misconstrued. He thought of Dona Neusa ironing a shirt she had not worn in years, of Helena pressing a scrap of newspaper to her lips like a promise. He thought of Marcelo's voice about liabilities and of the company's polished floors. As the passerby's thumb hovered, the sound of a bicycle bell cut through the morning. A child rode past, an ordinary life wheeling by, and the passerby breathed. He pressed send. He had not yet told anyone who he really was. For now, he remained a passerby in the eyes of the city, an unremarkable man with a scarf. But the small act of sending that email shifted something. It was the first formal step out of anonymity and into accountability. He had no applause. He had only the tentative satisfaction that comes from transforming private shame into public responsibility. The city spun on, unaware of the careful calculations made under its breath. The shop owner wiped his apron and noticed the passerby's retreat. He adjusted his sign, and for the moment, the world remained complicated and ordinary. Helena and Dona Neusa moved into their modest room with the faint confidence of people who had been offered a door that could close. They pinned the paper with the word steady and ate their soup in silence, which was sometimes the truest applause. Across town, a colleague named Marcelo read the passerby's message. He folded his hands and sat back, thinking and measured questions. He did not yet believe in miracles. He believed in systems. He believed that any kindness not framed by policy invited trouble. He opened his mouth to speak the next time their paths crossed, not with warmth, but with the language of caution. The passerby, for his part, understood that the path ahead would not be about single acts. It would be about the slow plumbing of systems, about convincing people who measured life and policies to accept that humanity required more than a ledger. He understood, too, that being known would change him, make him answer in ways that confession requires. He walked away from the viaduct that day with the scent of frying oil in his clothes and a small fortune of new facts in his head: the cost of rent, the number of hours a cook would need, the paperwork for accommodation. He opened his briefcase and spread a map across his desk. He underlined the words on an email thread and set a meeting with the cafeteria manager. He knew the next moves would not be dramatic. They would be long and quiet and practical. Under the bridge, Helena curled around the scarf the passerby had left her, and the paper boat he had folded sat on the sill like a future. Dona Neusa warmed the last of the stewed beans and counted the spoons in the drawer. The city continued its small cruelties and its small mercies.
The water on a dress had been washed away. The memory had not. It sat like a stain on a white tablecloth that prompted some people to change it and others to ignore it. As dusk collected itself along the rooftops, the passerby stood before an elevator in a building of glass and felt for the first time in his life the peculiar vulnerability of being seen. He had begun as someone who displaced humiliation and then stayed to make room. He was not a savior, and he did not want the language of heroism. He simply wanted the world to include people like Helena and Dona Neusa without having them be spectacles. A meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Marcelo planned to attend. The shop owner would likely grumble. The passerby folded his hands around a cup of coffee and thought of the paper-wrapped snack that had slid under the car. He placed both hands upon the cup and promised himself to be, above all else, steady. If this story is moving you, take a moment to like and share. Let someone else see that small things can change a life. He left the cup on his desk and stood. Outside, the city's lights blinked into being. He walked toward the subway with a quiet resolve. He had started with a scarf and a thermos. The next steps would ask for decisions tested not by sentiment, but by procedure. He wondered how many people in the office would choose procedure over a child's dignity.
He wondered if being the passerby meant stepping fully into the messy life of responsibility. At the subway entrance he paused, hands in his pockets, and pulled out his wallet. Inside, among business cards and receipts, lay a small photograph he had not intended to show anyone, a picture of a little girl with a crooked smile holding a half-eaten snack. He had kept it because it scared him to forget. He folded the photograph over so the face was hidden and walked into the train. The city carried him home. He imagined tables and schedules, forms to fill, and 1,000 small adjustments to make. He imagined facing skepticism and the weight of bureaucracy. He imagined Dona Nusa's hand steadying a ladle in a kitchen that wanted someone like her. He imagined Helena, who had offered him half a coxinha with a generosity that made his quiet life into something new, growing into a person who would know how to be kind to others. Decision, like courage, often came disguised as a mundane thing, a sent email, a signed form. He felt that he had taken the first, but he also knew that the water had already been poured, and that the act of stepping between a child and humiliation was the first of many tests. He did not yet know who would stand with him when more difficult choices came. He did not yet know whether the shop owner would become more dangerous or more small. He did not yet know if the company would accept the cost of kindness without making it a headline. He only knew he could not go back to being a passerby.
The name stamped inside his chest had changed from stranger to something he had not yet decided how to pronounce. As the train hummed forward, the city's blow stitched itself into the window glass. Somewhere beyond the bridge, a little paper boat rocked gently on a sill where a child kept her treasures. The passerby pressed his hand to the glass as if to connect. He had chosen a path that would require him to be known, to risk reputation and relationship. The first steps had been gentle, a scarf, a blanket, an email. But the road ahead promised more resistance, and perhaps more quiet miracles. He stepped off the train at his stop, and the scene folded back into the ordinary rhythm of life, the kind that makes a person wonder, later, which small, ordinary choice changed everything. The passerby walked into the night carrying the weight of a promise he had not yet fully made, and in a small room under a viaduct, a girl named Helena slept, wrapped in a scarf that smelled faintly of city and possibility. Morning arrived with a gray scrape across the windows. Daniel woke to the same city sounds: deliveries, a distant siren, the stairwell neighbor dropping a cardboard box, and for a moment the small quiet of responsibility settled over him like a second blanket. He had hit send the night before, and the email sat in someone else's inbox now, but the decisions it set in motion would not arrive neatly. They would arrive as meetings, as questions, as the slow arithmetic of payroll and permits. He dressed with the same care he had used when he first wrapped a scarf around a small pair of shoulders, deliberately, without fuss. At the company, the morning felt like any other, until it did not. The meeting room was bright with mid-morning light, and the usual signals of officialness: projectors, notepads, the soft shuffle of confidence. People came with the language of risk: auditors, managers, legal counsel. Marcelo arrived in a manner that suggested he had been waiting for someone to fail magnificently and had packed his disappointment like a talisman. He settled into his chair and watched Daniel with the careful curiosity of someone who cataloged people by their consistency with policy. Daniel listened as the cafeteria manager explained costs and health guidelines, as human resources spoke about payroll categories, and as the facilities team detailed a room that could, with modest renovation, be offered to a staff member. At each turn, numbers were named. At each turn, a finger of caution pointed toward precedent. The meeting felt briefly like the grinding of necessary gears. When Daniel finally spoke, it was in a voice stripped of drama. He did not enter the room with the photograph or the water-soaked story as a moral cudgel. He described simply and calmly what he had seen: a child crouched by a storefront, a hand pouring water from a plastic jug, and the way a small wrapped snack had slipped beneath a car and into shadow. He named the child Helena, and he named the woman who had stirred stockpots and kept family dinners honest, Dona Nusa. He did not ask for applause. He asked for one practical thing. Could a local, experienced cook be given an honest trial in the company cafeteria? And could the company offer a modest single room and staff housing for the duration of that initial transition? Marcelo leaned forward, pen poised. What assurances, he asked, are there that this will be sustainable, that it won't open a door we can't close? Daniel answered with a plan. He had thought the night through in the quiet corners of a train. Trial period, contract language, clear expectations, performance reviews, and an exit plan that allowed dignity for anyone who needed a different path. He suggested the position start part-time, with payroll aligned to company standards, and with a pathway to the local union, if that was appropriate. He had prepared nothing theatrical. He had prepared the kind of outline the company's counsel could read without blanching. The air in the room went from anticipatory to practical. Still, the question pulsed. Why had Daniel done this? Why risk the noise of personal involvement in what many insisted belonged only to structured charity? Daniel did not deflect. He said in a way that held no grandiosity that a child had been made to stand in the rain, and that the company had the means to do something that presence and hours could make real. He framed it as a question of capacity, not the capacity to feel, but the capacity to deliver reliable work and to pay for it fairly. That afternoon, the small trial was approved. The wording was careful, the budget was modest, the approval had the cautious signature of committees. It was not a sweep of benevolence, it was a controlled pilot. Daniel felt relief, but it was the kind that loosens the shoulders rather than produces fireworks. He had not sought applause, he had sought a structure. The company would hire Donna Nusa. They would offer a temporary room. They would pay and document and measure. Word moved in the city in unpredictable ways. It crept from the cafeteria manager to the cleaning staff to a mid-level reporter who liked human pieces about corporate social responsibility. Within a week, there was a small, neutral article online about a local catering pilot that aimed to bring authentic neighborhood cooks into a corporate lunchroom. The article mentioned a tender trial and the name of the cook. It printed a quote from the cafeteria manager that read like a press release. "We welcome trying new, locally sourced menus." The shop owner across the street, who had poured water and not considered the child behind it, read the same headline. He was not a man who used the internet as a mirror. He read the headline at the counter when a customer pointed it out.
The story said little about the pouring of water. News had a way of trimming the edges, but the shop owner understood implication, and, more dangerously for him, the idea that someone might have watched and acted. His pride tightened in his chest like a fist. He had been angry that morning, worried about customers, about tests, about the way a persistent child might attract authorities who would measure the wrong things. He had meant to make a point. The jug had felt as good as any argument. He had not expected the jug to create a problem that would return with signatures and schedules. He called out to the passerby's anonymous face. He asked around the street and learned that the man with the scarf had suggested a trial at the big place. The owner's hands trembled with a different agitation now, fear of being judged in a world where reputations could be folded into headlines. He decided that if he was to be confronted, he would prefer a private one. Daniel had intended to remain inconspicuous. Anonymity had allowed him to act without spectacle. But once decisions began to have consequence, anonymity became a barrier to accountability. He visited the viaduct that weekend, not to take photographs or to parade a new life, but to share a small update and to ask if they had needs that the contract would not address. He found Helena arranging a row of small pebbles on the crate and Donna Nusa mending a hole in an old apron. "You did it," Helena said, without surprise, as if she had expected it and timed the world by such small certainties. "We did a thing," Daniel said. His hands folded around a cup of coffee a visitor had pressed into them. He was not ready to sign his name to newspaper headlines. He merely explained the practicalities, a trial schedule, an agreement for fair hours, and a key that would open a real door. Donna Nusa listened. She had a way of measuring what could be true by seeing whether practical things, like a spoon or a ledger, came with a promise that would not demand humiliation. She accepted the parameters. If the job meant she could cook in a real kitchen and get paid without being patronized, she would try. She had always been proud of the meals that brought people to the table. She thought she might be able to bring that pride back as work. "You don't have to make us spectacles," she said quietly. "We have enough to fix without an audience." Daniel understood that line. He did not want a press release's glare. He wanted to make ordinary a little more honest. For him, the company pilot was a way to fold knowledge and resources into a pattern that made dignity routine rather than a headline. The trial went forward. Donna Nusa arrived at the bright cafeteria early the first morning with a thermos, a small spice tin, and a nerve-steadying smile. The kitchen's stainless steel reflected the overhead lights, the kind of brightness that makes everyone feel like a novice the first time. She moved with the rhythm of a lifetime of service.
chopping, seasoning, timing, and there was a plain, fierce competence to it. The employees watched, ate, and discovered that simple stews and gently seasoned rice could be more than sustenance. They could be a reminder that food could carry memory, and that a person who had known how to coax flavor from meager things had value. After the first week, payroll processed, the company issued a modest contract, and a small room was prepared. It was not charity. The paperwork described it as staff accommodation for a temporary hire, an arrangement with a clear end date and a pathway for extension if needed. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and laundry detergent. It had a window that caught sunrise and a metal bed that folded into neat corners. For Helena, it felt like a planetarium of possibility. As she stepped across the threshold for the first time, barefoot and clutching a small paper boat she had folded from the corner of a newspaper, she paused. The passerby had offered the scarf, the company had offered a room, and now the small question she had asked herself more times than she admitted rose like a timid bird in her throat. She looked up at the window, and then at the man who had never wanted to be named, and she asked simply, "Can I sleep here?" The question landed like an invitation, in the way that children ask the questions that adults sometimes disguise. Hers cut straight through necessary explanations and policy language and asked the single thing that mattered. Is this a place to be safe? Daniel crouched, the habit of humility intact, and nodded. He did not need to say much. The room was offered, and the key was in Dona Nusa's hand. Permission had been granted in the smallest, most human form, an open door. Helena's acceptance of that room was not a promise to the future so much as a claim to a present that she had been denied. She curled under a blanket whose seams had been mended by a passerby who had learned the work of steady hands. She placed her paper boat on the windowsill. That night she slept like someone who had finally found shore after a small, discriminatory storm. Life did not become tidy. There were forms to fill. The union required a meeting. The facilities team asked questions about fire codes. Payroll needed tax details. There were small humiliations, one that made Dona Nusa have to present a copy of an ID she had never kept at hand, but each one was navigated slowly, with an ear to the grandmother's pride. Daniel signed forms, arranged a modest advance on a first paycheck, and made sure the first 2 weeks' wages were deposited early. Those were practical kindnesses. They did not make him a hero. They made him a participant in the slow work of rearranging life. Word of the company's small pilot reached further. Some colleagues who had been quietly watching asked to help.
A few volunteered for a roster that would allow staff to work one lunch shift in the new rotation, so the company could maintain operations while giving a steady client base. Others brought in jars of spices and second-hand aprons. The cafeteria manager reinvented a small part of the menu, and the office, usually a place measured in targets and metrics, learned to measure in bowls. Marcella watched these developments with a mix of professional skepticism and something else, curiosity that refused to die. He had made his objections known in the meeting room, but when he came to sample Dona Nilsa's cooking one ordinary lunch hour, he did so with his arms folded and a reputation to keep. He sat in a corner and tasted a spoonful of stew with a critical face that took time to soften. Then he tasted another spoonful. He walked back to his desk with a slow shift in his shoulders, none of which would make a press release. "I'll admit it," he told Daniel later, when both of them found themselves in the same elevator, gravity of smallness between them. "She knows how to season a good bean." Daniel accepted the concession without triumph. There was no need. The work itself was what mattered. Meals made, hours scheduled, a pay stub that read like a ticket toward stability. Marcelo would not become a bell clapper for social programs overnight, but his language would change from categorical refusal to cautious curiosity, and that small turn mattered. The shop owner, meanwhile, carried his own private reckoning. Mr. Costa, his name printed under a fading awning, had always measured his world by the cleanliness of his counters and the regularity of customers. The idea that someone had recorded and acted on his moment of impatience gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. He wondered about pride and reputation, and whether the man in the scarf had simply been passing, or had the audacity to expect a share of accountability.
He decided, without fanfare, to fix a sign that had been peeling for months. It was an action small enough to be unseen and honest enough to make him feel like he was doing something better. When Daniel finally crossed the street and approached the shop, he did so not to accuse, but to offer the chance to speak. He found Mr. Costa leaning on his counter, wiping his hands with a dish towel. The heat from the grill made the doorway a warm rectangle. "You were there the day a child got soaked," Daniel said. He did not demand contrition. He offered an observation instead, an invitation to a conversation. "I don't want to make a scene. I wanted to talk." Mr. Costa looked him over the way a man looks at a tool he might use. "You the man who made her leave?" he asked, the old defensive reflex showing itself. "You caused trouble in my shop." "I stopped it," Daniel said. "That's all." Mr. Costa's mouth worked like someone chewing a difficult fruit. "Caused trouble. That's what I get told by the man who thinks he's God," he muttered.
Then, quieter. "Why did you do it? Why didn't you leave it alone?" Daniel thought of the damp dress, of Helena's hand protecting a tiny snack. Because when someone is treated like they belong outside the city shrinks. I wanted the city to include her. Mr. Costa looked at the counter as if he could see the water stain still. He had been hurried that day. He had been afraid of inspectors and of customers who complained about loitering. He had used the jug like authority. He had not meant to hurt, he told himself, and yet he could see the thin face of the child who had not cried at all. The memory prigged at him. "I don't want customers seeing people sleeping here," he said, the argument that had felt reasonable when he had acted. It was the language of fear. "They complain. They stop coming. I have rent." Daniel did not contradict the economics. He listened. He offered instead what he had learned from dealing with a company, an example rather than a reprimand. "We hired someone nearby," he said. "The company will pay for meals. They'll be regular. Maybe it will bring more customers who want a lunch that remembers flavor." The shop owner's face folded in on itself. He had never imagined that an act he thought small could ripple into a larger question about the kind of man he wanted to be. He agreed, without ceremony, to change a sign that had 2 words, "No loitering." He replaced it with a small chalkboard that read menus and daily specials. It was not an apology in capitals, but it was change. It was the kind of small movement that tracks toward a different habit. Months moved in a way that let people keep their dignity. Don Enos's contract went through an extension. The company decided to keep the kitchen pilot as a semi-permanent offering. Their balance sheets accepted the numbers because the food was good and because employees liked the variety. Payrolls were made and taxes paid. The legal department breathed a little easier when they saw proper documentation. The room and staff housing became a home for a family that, for so long, had been expected to make beds out of cardboard. Helena started school 2 months into the arrangement. The first day, she wore a pair of shoes that fitted like a small miracle and carried a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She walked into the classroom with the kind of boldness children have when their stomachs are not the loudest thing in the room. At school, she learned to read in a way that outpaced even the small determined way she had taught herself under a bridge. Her teacher liked to say that Helena approached letters like someone discovered a new world and wanted the maps. She came home with scribbled exercises and the names of afternoons spelled out. Her stack of books, once a modest thrift shop accumulation, grew. Daniel bought a small desk lamp for her crate and left it on the windowsill like a promise. Light for late-night pages. The ripple extended into the cafeteria in ways no one had anticipated. Employees who once ate in the same benighted routine now lingered to speak with the cook and to ask about recipes. Someone suggested that the company host an open meal once a month, where staff could bring family members and where the cafeteria would open to neighborhood folks. The idea suited both marketing and the fragile contours of a community that wanted to see itself recognized. The HR department crafted rules. The legal team measured them. The event happened anyway, and the line at the door that day looked less like a queue and more like a neighborhood reunion. Helena brought her paper boat to the event and placed it on the edge of the serving line as if offering it. People smiled. Someone took a picture and shared it online with a caption that did not turn the child into spectacle, but celebrated a small human fact. Food had brought strangers together. Daniel watched from a corner that day, feeling less like a passerby and more like someone who had signed up for the long work. A colleague came up and offered a loaf of bread. Marcelo, already softened by a few shared lunches, raised a paper napkin as a toast and said with a half-embarrassed smile, "To good beans and steady things." A reporter came by for a follow-up piece and asked Daniel if he would give an interview. He declined. He did not want the story to be about him. He wanted it to be about the people who made the food and the child who read in scraps. But the fact of attention meant that the shop owner's earlier action could not remain only a private mistake. Mr. Costa, ever practical, rehearsed an apology. He did not want it broadcast like a confession. He wanted to say sorry in a way that might make sense to the woman who had lost a restaurant and to the girl who had lost dignity. He baked a small batch of sweet rolls one morning and walked across the street. He waited, hands sweating, and offered the tray with his voice cracked in the way pride shows when it wants to soften. "I am sorry," he said, not elegantly. "I was afraid. I did wrong." Dona Nosa took a roll, turned it in her hands as if testing heat, and said with the measured kindness of someone who had been in kitchens long enough to know how things burned and healed, "We can be neighbors." It was not a grand reconciliation. It was a daily agreement to act different tomorrow. The shop owner returned to his counter with a small relief that felt like a weight removed from his chest. He kept his shop cleaner and asked sometimes if the company would like to source bread. He began to see the neighborhood as a place where customers could be customers and neighbors could be not merely customers. Time, that slow mechanic, rearranged small things into new patterns. The company's pilot turned into a small program that aimed to hire people from the community where possible. The cafeteria's menu rotated to include neighborhood favorites with a nod to the cooks who taught them. Employees volunteered in ways that changed office rhythms. A lawyer taught basic rights at a community center. A marketing assistant organized a book drive for the Viaduct library Helena had begun at the Crate. Helena grew in ways that made adults uncertain. She became a small ambassador of sorts, not by command, but because of curiosity. She would show a visiting colleague how she arranged her pebble line, or how she could sound out the names above the cereal boxes. She took to writing little notes and leaving them on the cafeteria window. One read simply, "Thank you for making food that tastes like home." People who ate that lunch read it and felt seen in a way paperwork rarely achieves. Daniel's life shifted too, quietly. He had expected to spend himself in small practicalities, arranging pay, dealing with facilities, but he found that the deeper work was being visible in a way he had avoided for years. Reputation became part of his calculus. He had to speak at staff meetings and answer questions about allocation and fairness. He had to defend the small pilot on spreadsheets. He had to face his own fear of being judged for doing what he had always felt he should do. He learned with a humbling patience that doing small, steady work required being steady enough to take criticism and patient enough to wait for effect. One afternoon, months after the original incident, the company hosted a small event to celebrate community partnerships. Daniel sat on a low stage and listened to colleagues share short reflections. When it was his turn, he did not speak about himself. He spoke about the woman who could make a bean sing and the child who hid her snack under a car because she had learned that shadow was safer than open space. He named them. He said that sometimes the best uses of resources were the ones that gave someone pieces of a life back: a kitchen to stand in, a room with a door that closed, a school with a teacher who counted on a child's presence. After the event, Mr. Costa found him in a quiet corridor and offered a small handshake. It had been a long road to softening. "You didn't have to come back to talk," Mr. Costa said. "I thought you were just another stranger." "No," Daniel said. "I couldn't be." Mr. Costa's eyes lingered. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "I did not think of the child that way. I only thought about my customers. That is a hard thing to change." "It is," Daniel said, "but it is still the right thing." Mr. Costa nodded. The man who had poured the water had learned, like most people who change, slowly and with a mix of shame and relief.
He began to leave a small basket of rolls on the counter each morning with a sign that read, "Pay what you can." It was not charity performed on stage. It was a quiet attempt to share in ways he could manage. Not everyone loved the changes.
Some neighbors grumbled that the company was meddling, that the cafeteria had lost its consistency. A few employees resisted the new program as an unnecessary distraction from profit. There were bureaucracies to navigate and permit renewals to file, and the small victories were often accompanied by small setbacks. But on balance, the weather shifted. People who had been invisible found steady rhythms. A seam of dignity stitched itself into the neighborhood's fabric. Helena grew taller in months you could measure by shoes rather than seasons. She learned the name of her teacher's dog and could recite the months of the year without hesitation. She kept her paper boat on the windowsill for a long time, even when the window was cleaned and a new curtain came in. Daniel visited sometimes and would find the boat and leave a small coin near it. No more than that, for publicity had not become his goal. Once, when he arrived early, he found Helena standing with a handful of the company's children's books and a long list she had scrawled for herself. Words I will learn this month. He sat down with her and helped sound out the hardest of them. She would giggle at his funny voices and then settle into an ease that seemed to make them both larger. At the end of the session, she handed him something folded into soap paper, a small bread-shaped ornament she had made from leftover dough at Dona Nusa's kitchen. It was hard as clay and smelled faintly of spices. "It is a present," she said, "so you remember." He kept the ornament on his desk for a long time. It reminded him of the beginner's heart he had been too often to lose. The man who stepped into a moment because it was the only right action. He had, in the end, become the kind of person who wore responsibility like an unfinished task he could carry home. The story did not become legend. It did not climb the charts of viral sensation. It became a collection of daily practices. Payrolls paid, doors closed, lunches that tasted like home. People learned to listen, and the company learned that a little risk, well managed, could lead to real work that mattered. Years later, when Helena had a confidence like an old friend and a smile that had deepened into something steady, Daniel stood in the cafeteria watching a line of children learn to chop vegetables under supervision. He had grown used to the small domestic harmonies of the place, the sort of rhythms that make workplaces into communities. He had, over time, stopped being the anonymous passerby in the eyes of the people who mattered. His name was known in the office and in the neighborhood. He still carried the photograph he had folded and hid in his wallet, but it had changed. Now it was a picture of a child with bright eyes at a lunch line, and the caption on the paper read, in a small child's handwriting, "Thank you for making room." On a slow afternoon, Helena visited him at his desk with something wrapped in wax paper. She pressed it into his hand and waited like someone passing an offering. "What is it?" he asked. She beamed. "It's a coxinha I made," she said. "It's not perfect, but it is for you." He opened it slowly, like one opens a letter. The warmth spilled across his palms. He tasted it, and it tasted like a story, oily, honest, and with a little spice. He had kept so many small, practical cares for others that he had forgotten how small gifts could carry gratitude backward, changing the giver as much as the receiver. "Why give me this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because sometimes people who save you aren't the ones who need saving," she said, with the kind of wisdom children sometimes wear without knowing its weight. He smiled. "I'll keep it," he said. He wrapped it back in the wax paper and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, like a relic of a life that had been rearranged. Outside, the city did what cities do. It moved, it hunked, it rewired itself minute by minute. In the viaduct's small room, a paper boat still bobbed on the windowsill. In the cafeteria, someone left a small sign that read, "Community Meals, Saturday 12 to 2. The shop owner, who had once poured water, learned to hold a spatula without fist tightness and to greet customers with a more even voice. Marcelo had become the kind of colleague who, while still preferring spreadsheets, would sometimes ask for a second helping. One evening, years after the first incident, Daniel found himself standing on the other side of the street, watching a small child hide a snack under a car.
His hands tightened for a moment. Memory is a muscle that never forgets its first strain. The child's shirt was small, her shoes scuffed, and something familiar tightened in his chest. He crossed the street without a plan. He did not carry a jug. He carried only the same simple impulses he had learned long ago: steady presence, a warm hand, a question asked without accusation. He crouched and looked at the child with the same softness he had once used, and he asked, "What's your name?" She looked up, startled, and then said, clearly, "Maya." He smiled and did something small and ordinary. He offered his hand and a wrapped snack, and she accepted. The pattern repeated, because kindness is an apprenticeship that needs repeating to become habit. As he walked back toward the glow of the office lights, he felt that old, strange contraction of being known and being responsible. He had learned over time that being the person who steps between humiliation and a child requires more than courage. It requires the willingness to be accountable in the long run. He had learned to carry that accountability not as a burden of self-righteousness, but as a steady work of making space. If you find yourself moved by this story, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Look for the Helens in your city, the small people who might simply need room to sleep, eat, or belong.
Small gestures can become structures. Small decisions, when practiced, can change what a neighborhood expects of itself. Helena once asked, in a voice that still belonged to a child, "Can I sleep here?" The answer she received was not only a bed and a roof, but a promise that someone had seen her and then had stayed long enough to make sure she could keep sleeping there.